محمد. الثاني على حب الحسن والحسين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الثالثة بحب الزهراء بأعلى أصواتكم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. Respected brothers and sisters, my dear youngsters and elders, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, I would like to first and foremost begin by sending our condolences to the awaited Savior, Imam al-Mahdi. May Allah hasten his reappearance, to the Shia of Amir al-Mu'mineen worldwide, and to you all, inshaAllah, on the martyrdom, the grave martyrdom of our Master Abi Abdullah al-Hussein, as we commemorate him, and we have commemorated him over the last 20-25 nights, as well as obviously, inshaAllah, the person who we are remembering tonight in specific, Imam Zayn al-Abidin, Imam al-Sajjad, his martyrdom. Inshallah, tonight, in his remembrance, in the remembrance of his father, Abi Abdullah al-Hussein, we will begin, inshallah, and we'll jump straight into the lecture as we are tight on time. So please help me in welcoming my dear brother, Sayyid Yasir Dhialdeen. Please welcome him with a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا رسول الله. صلى الله عليك يا سيدي ويا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله. يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة ويا عبرة كل مؤمن ومؤمنة، يا ليتنا فوز فوزا عظيما. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الذين قالوا ربنا الله ثم استقاموا تتنزل عليهم الملائكة ألا تخافوا ولا تحزنوا وأبشروا بالجنة التي كنتم توعدون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Let us illuminate our majlis with the recitation of a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam, another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. As we commemorate the martyrdom of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam on nights like these, it is from the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that his martyrdom and the tragedy of his martyrdom is also in the nights in which he was experiencing the tragedy of Karbala. After the Battle of Karbala, on nights like these, Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam was still in the parades and in the shackles of the enemies of Allah as they took them from one city to another, parading them as prisoners, from Karbala to Kufa and to Sham, from palace to palace. And throughout this time, Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam was reviving the message of Imam al-Hussein. He stood for the same message that Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam stood for. The same goal that Imam al-Hussein wished to achieve was also Imam al-Sajjad's goal. He wanted to maintain the sanctity of the faith, to maintain the sanctity of the religion of Islam. And the climate was the same at the time. Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, after the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein, they still wanted to destroy the sanctity of Islam. They wanted to turn, Bani Umayyah specifically wanted to turn Medina into a city of fasad. That was their goal. Their goal was to turn it into a city of degeneracy, a city of sins, public sins. Is to focus on this concept of a struggle. When we hear the word jihad nowadays, we think of it as a negative connotation. Immediately our minds go to bloodshed and terrorism. But the reality is that's not what the meaning of the word is. It is one of our 10 roots, one of our 10 branches of faith, Dhialdeen. It's a wajib, it's an obligatory act upon us all. What does it mean if it's obligatory upon us all? What is the meaning of this word? Is it truly just bloodshed and terrorism as the propaganda teaches us and the media tells us to think, society nowadays tells us to think? Or is there a meaning, a deeper meaning behind it? And that's the goal, is to teach myself and remind myself first, before reminding you all of an ability to dismantle this narrative. When someone tells you that word is a negative connotation, it ruins the image of Islam, you should be equipped with the knowledge to be able to fight that. And to show that no, this is actually something much more than just battle and war. And I will explain that after a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So how is it much more than just that? There's a narration from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. Amir al-Mu'mineen says he sent a troop to battle. We've all heard the story. He sent them to a battle. When they came back from this battle, from this expedition, he welcomed them and he told them, "Marhaban biqawmin qadaw al-jihad al-asghar wa baqiya alayhim al-jihad al-akbar." He says, welcome, greetings to the troops who have just completed the minor jihad, the minor struggle. And they are left with the major struggle. They are left with the major jihad. So they asked him, Ya Rasulullah, what is the major jihad? What do you mean by that? He says, the major jihad is what? He says, jihadun nafs. He says, afdalul jihad man jahada nafsahu allati bayna janbay. He says the jihad, the major struggle is the one between you and yourself. Between you and yourself that's inside you, your inner self. Between your aql and your delusion, between your intellect and your delusion, and the shaitan and your desires. This is the major jihad. And this is the greatest of jihad. He says this is the greatest of struggles, the one who fights and struggles against his inner self. And so this is the first way in which we should understand jihad when we hear it. Understand our struggle, is that it's the struggle between us, within us, and ourselves. That's the one that we must focus on the most, is the struggle between ourselves. So what is the steps? We always hear, you must battle your inner self. You must defeat your nafs, defeat your desires. Do we ever have specific steps to find a solution to do so? Yes. The scholars of akhlaq, they define specific instructions that we can take in order to defeat our nafs. They give us a formula that we should follow. The first step, they say, to defeat your nafs in your struggle against yourself is to acknowledge your problems. Now this might sound very like common sense, very cliche. You have to acknowledge your problem. It doesn't require someone with a background in a specific degree to know that when you want to find a solution to a problem, you must first acknowledge that there's a problem. However, it's not that simple. It's not as easy as it sounds. The reality is what happens when we continue to give in to our desires, when we continue to give in to our to the shaitan and to what the shaitan tells us to do, eventually we no longer are capable to understand and to see that what we're doing is a problem. We lose that ability. An example is an individual who tells you, I'm going to delay my salah, I'll pray later. At another time in the day, I'll pray. Or I'll pray after, a few days from now, a few years from now, whenever I get the chance to, I'll pray my salat. The reality is this person knows that probably not going to pray their salah. It's likely that they have a feeling that they don't really believe inside that they will pray eventually. But what happens here? What's the true problem here? What's occurring is that they don't value the salah anymore. The shaitan has made it has become normal to them that the shaitan has now removed their ability to understand their problem. And now they no longer value the prayer itself. And this is what happens. This is what happened on the day of Ashura. The conversation between Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam and Imam al-Sajjad during the farewell, Imam al-Sajjad asks Imam al-Hussein, what did you do to these munafiqeen, to these hypocrites? Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam looks at him, he tells him, إِنَّهُمْ قَوْمٌ اسْتَحْوَذَ عَلَيْهِمُ الشَّيْطَانِ فَأَنْسَاهُمْ ذِكْرَ اللَّهِ. He says this is a tribe that shaitan has taken over them, and he has made them forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He has made them forget Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They no longer remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we don't acknowledge our problem, and when we continue to put it aside, brush it aside, not consider it a big deal, eventually we lose our ability to acknowledge the problem entirely. And we no longer think we have a problem. So that's our first step. Find your problem. Pick it out, see what it is, and then from there you move on to your next steps. But what is it? Do you have a problem with your salah? Do you have a problem with your fasting? Do you have a problem with your eyes and controlling your eyes, or controlling your tongue, or controlling what you listen to? Pinpoint the problem, and then from there you move on. And we all have this struggle. Everyone is going through this struggle. But are we going to be the ones to make a change, or are we going to just struggle, the basic struggle that everyone is going through? And so that's the first step, to acknowledge your issue. After you have acknowledged your issue, the scholars break it down in a beautiful analogy. They say you must now consider yourself to be a business employee. Every transaction you make should be a business transaction with yourself. And what do they mean by that? They say the first step when you hire an employee is to do what? The first step when you're hiring an employee is to get a contract. And they sign this contract. This contract should list what they have to do, what their obligations are, what their wages are, so on and so forth. Everything is written in front of them, and a plan is set in place for what they have to fulfill. When you consider yourself as your employee, you will now write a contract with it. You now set your goals with yourself. That is the next step. Find out what the issue is, set your goals, and write it down. We hear this, we hear all of this in famous self-help books. They tell you, write everything you down, whatever you want to achieve as a goal, you write it down on pen and paper. This is the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, the scholars of akhlaq. They're teaching us how to achieve the goal that is most important to us and is defeating ourselves, defeating our nafs. So you write it down, and then the step after that is to maintain supervision over yourself. Track your progress, monitor yourself. The same way you monitor an employee, you see their progress, the supervisor gives the boss a progress report, outcomes, measurements on how they're doing so far. You should do that to yourself. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who's monitoring you. And He's seeing you. The angels are writing down everything you do. All the actions you commit, good and bad, they're writing it down. The verse of the Holy Quran says, مَا يَلْفِظُ مِنْ قَوْلٍ إِلَّا لَدَيْهِ رَقِيبٌ عَتِيدٌ. Not a word is uttered in which an angel is not writing down. Everything you do, the angel's writing down. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is monitoring us. We should monitor ourselves as well. If we want growth, we must monitor ourselves. Imam Ali alayhi salam says, "Man hasaba nafsah rabih, wa man ghafala anha khasir." Whoever keeps himself accountable is successful, and whoever doesn't keep themselves accountable and is heedless with themselves, they fail. The recipe for success with Imam Ali alayhi salam, keeping ourselves accountable. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And so the steps are clear. We must acknowledge our issue, and then we must take action by writing it down, preparing our goals of what we want to change, and keeping ourselves accountable. Slowly we will see progress. The verse of the Holy Quran says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهُ ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا تَتَنَزَّلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. The verse says, whoever stands firm in their faith, the angels will descend upon him and support them and congratulate them. Now the interpreters, they say that this verse means the angels will come down during the time of your death. However, they also mention that they will come down throughout your life. And next time you appear in a situation where you are going through your struggle, and you are going through that battle within yourself, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send these angels down to support you. And slowly over time it becomes easier. The first time you want to avoid fulfilling that desire that you have in a haram way, it may be very difficult. But slowly over time, once you say no the first time, it gets easier, and that's as promised by this verse. So this is the first step of jihad, and the first analogy and example of jihad is jihad al-nafs, to defeat your nafs. Now scholars also break down jihad into more than just the major and the minor. They say in between the major and the minor jihad comes two other jihads. And they're so important that they have their own category. And that is Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar. These two, Amr bil Ma'ruf, being to enjoin the good, and Nahi anil Munkar, forbidding the evil, are so important of a struggle that they have their own category according to the scholars, as a part of jihad that comes before the minor jihad. So let's speak about Amr bil Ma'ruf and our duties with Amr bil Ma'ruf, and how it is a struggle for us and how we can overcome this struggle. The reality is, when you talk about Amr bil Ma'ruf, you have two different groups who act upon this. And these are two extreme groups, far from the members of this community. The first group is those who completely refuse to do Amr bil Ma'ruf. And what will they do? They'll give themselves a million excuses as to why they don't have to do it. For example, Salah time comes, they don't want to be that person to get up and say, it's time for Salah, let's get up and pray. They say, oh, it's an uncomfortable situation, I don't want to risk it, it's not worth it, so on and so forth. They don't even approach the situation at all. That's one group. Now this group will be held accountable on the Day of Judgment. If their reasons are not justified, if they didn't even make an attempt and find a way to do their Amr bil Ma'ruf, they will be held accountable for it. On the other hand, the opposite of that is those who push everything down your throat. You have that one person who has to always be that guy. Immediately something happens, it's Salah time. If you don't pray, he'll drag you to Salah, he'll force you upon it, he'll be the policeman on you. That's another extreme. Another extreme that we should avoid. This you must consider your akhlaq. You must consider the way you act around people. If you continue to do that, you may be pushing people away from the act itself. You might be doing the opposite of it. And so this will also be held accountable on the Day of Judgment. So our goal is to meet in the middle. Back to the analogy of Salah. If Salah time comes and you decided to be the person, to do your job, Amr bil Ma'ruf, call for prayer, let's say you get backlash. It's very possible. It's very possible that people will not like it. Especially nowadays with our youth, you'll hear what? I don't want to be reminded about Salah. Don't tell me. I'd rather not be told what to do. I'll pray myself. Don't remind me to pray. You might get this backlash. And if this does happen, and if it continues to happen, and if it's causing more harm than good, your religious obligation is complete. You no longer have to do it anymore. However, should we stop there? Should we give up on our family members? Should we give up on our community members, on our friends, and just because they refuse to do it, we're going to let it go and let it slide and no longer do our job of Amr bil Ma'ruf? We shouldn't do that. The idea is we must find creative ways and better ways to do Amr bil Ma'ruf than just saying it out loud. And we know the story of Imam al-Hasan and Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam. As young children, they were performing wudu one day. They saw an elderly man performing wudu one day, and he wasn't performing it correctly. So they went to this man, and instead of telling him, you're doing your wudu wrong, they said, please, O elderly man, ya Sheikh, teach us how to perform wudu. One of us will do it. Just correct us if we do it incorrectly. Look at the manners of the Ahlul Bayt. And so they performed their wudu, and they were doing it the correct way, and the man realized that he's doing it wrong, and they're doing it correctly. And that's how he learned, through a creative way and an indirect way of performing Amr bil Ma'ruf. Another story encapsulates this idea perfectly. I was speaking to a friend of mine about this topic, and he told me, he said, one day, I was in my back, before I was able to understand how to act around people, I was very close-minded. I was always, everything was my way. You know, it was my way or the highway, and I was always doing it aggressively, telling people what to do aggressively. And so one day I met this new friend, he says, at university, and he was a Muslim brother, and I became friends with him, and we began studying together. And then I began praying. Days would come where we're studying in the library, and Salah time comes, and then I go to him, and I tell him, I'm going to go to the prayer room, come join me in Salah. First day, he made an excuse. Second day, he made an excuse. Third day, he made an excuse. I realized at this point that he doesn't want to pray with me, or he doesn't want to get up and pray. And so he says, I decided I'm no longer obligated to do my job. I now know, as well, on top of that, he also mentioned, he told him, I don't like it that you continue to remind me in this way. So he realized that now his obligation is complete. He no longer has to perform this duty. And so he left it. And then one day he came to the masjid, he said, and he heard a lecture. And in the lecture, he heard a story that changed his mind completely. He said, the speaker spoke about a story of Ibrahim alayhi salam. He said, Ibrahim alayhi salam, every time he wanted to eat a meal, he would have to sit and eat a meal with someone else. He'd always invite someone to have food with him. And so whenever he had food, if he had nobody with him in the area, he would go out in the streets and call upon whoever's there to come and join him in his meal. So one day, Ibrahim alayhi salam ran into an atheist. He was the only person there. He invited him for dinner. And so he joined Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. And as they were about to eat their meal, Prophet Ibrahim told him, the only thing I ask for you to join me in my meal is to recite Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Begin your meal in the name of Allah. That's all that I ask for. It's my only request from you. The man said, no, I will not do that. I don't believe in Allah. I'm not going to say Bismillah when I eat my food. He refused, and Ibrahim refused to give him the food. He told him that I am unable to feed you today. You may leave. As soon as this man left, Angel Jibreel came down on Ibrahim alayhi salam, and he told him, he said, Allah is not pleased with what you just did. And he says that I have been sustaining this man for 40 years of his life, giving him food, giving him water, giving him clothing, giving him shelter, giving him family. And not once did I ask for him to remember me. And not once did I ask for him to give anything in return. And I never turned him away. And just because of one refusal to mention my name, you turned him away? Ibrahim alayhi salam rushed to that man and he told him the story. He invited him back for food, told him the story, and the man became a Muslim. He believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the lesson here that struck this individual that I was speaking to, he said that it shocked me how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even with the atheists, He never turns away from them. And it's out of love for His creation. Why should I leave my friend? Why should I lose hope and no longer try to do my amr bil ma'roof and enjoying the good so he can succeed and become better? I care about him. I want for him to succeed. And so I decided not to lose hope. I decided to be a little more creative in the way I approached the situation. He says, I began to think, brainstorming of ways that I can now approach the situation so I can help him. Until I decided to stop going to the prayer room. He says, from now on, I began praying in the library, and I decided that I'm going to pray every time in his line of sight. So whenever it's salat time, my way of expressing to him that it's salat time will be just to go and pray in front of him. And I did this, risking the chance that other people will also see me with that potential there, and it's uncomfortable. Seeing other people seeing you pray may be uncomfortable, but I risked this. And I thought that this may be a better form in which I can enjoy the good. And so he says he did that. And over time, a few days later, a few weeks later passed, his friend comes up to him and he asks him, he begins to inquire about the salah. He says, what is it that you're so committed to your salah? Every time salah comes, you get up and pray. What is it about your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that you don't miss your salah, not a single day? And he began to ask questions. And slowly, one day he came and joined me in salah, he says. And then a few days later, he invited me to go pray in the prayer room himself. This is how you must act. You must not lose your hope, first of all, and then find creative ways to do amr bil ma'roof, to enjoin the good, to welcome people through your akhlaq and through your mannerism. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. This is the way of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, to find creative ways, to not force it down everyone's throats, and to welcome them with their akhlaq, with their manners. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam says, "Kunu du'atan lin-nasi bighayri alsinatikum." Be an invitation towards the people without your tongue. Do it with your actions. And this is a form of enjoining the good. And this is the struggle that we have to face as a part of our jihad and our struggle. And the second or the third one after jihad al-nafs and amr bil-ma'ruf is nahi anil munkar. And now is the time in the world we live in today and the occurrences that are happening now, this one stands out. We must fulfill this one as a priority, and we don't have any excuses. The narration says, if you're unable to stop evil with your hands, you stop it with your tongue. If you're unable to stop evil with your tongue, you stop it with your heart. At least inside of you, refuse this act of evil. Today, we no longer fall under this category. We cannot say we just sit back and refuse evil in our hearts. No, we live in a world where we have the freedom to use our voice, the freedom to use our hands, and to be able to stop the oppression that's occurring. Specifically, the oppression that's occurring in the Middle East, the oppression against Palestine and the Muslims in Palestine. It's our obligation to stand with them to forbid evil against those tyrants and oppressors. And we're not allowed to just sit back and believe it in our hearts anymore. Nowadays, what will you hear? You'll hear those people who claim to be scholars, they'll tell you you're unable to speak up against the government, against the authority. Specifically about this occurrence with Palestine, they'll tell you you can't attack the oppressors because who knows that they're the oppressors, they'll say. They'll tell you it's unclear who the oppressors really are. It's unclear who's the victim and who's the oppressor, the aggressor. So you can't pick a side, and you can't defend, you can't even speak up about them and speak up against them. SubhanAllah, these are the same people who defend Muawiyah. And they have an excuse for Muawiyah. What's the excuse in defense of Muawiyah? Muawiyah, in the battle of Siffin, his army, they killed Ammar ibn Yasir. Ammar ibn Yasir, he was the great companion of Rasulullah. His father and his mother were amongst the first martyrs of Islam. And so he was killed in the battle of Siffin. And what happened before the martyrdom of Ammar ibn Yasir? During the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he said, and this is narrated in all schools of thought, in the books of all schools of thought, he says, Ammar taqtuluhu al-fi'atu al-baghiyah. He says, Ammar will be killed by the enemies, by the transgressors. They will kill Ammar ibn Yasir. He says, يَدْعُوهُمْ إِلَى الْجَنَّةِ وَيَدْعُونَهُ إِلَى النَّارِ. He will invite them to paradise and to heaven, and they will invite him to hellfire. And that's what happened. On the day of Siffin, the battle of Siffin, Ammar ibn Yasir stood up. He prepared and he spoke an amazing sermon. He said famous lines that we hear. He says, "Oh Allah, "Oh Allah, you know that if I knew your pleasure was for me to stab myself and to pull the sword out of my back, I would have done it. But I know that your pleasure today is in me battling these enemies of Allah." He stood there showing everyone which side he's on and that he's against the enemies. Of course, this is just for the sake of the argument I'm saying this, because we don't need any proof from Ammar ibn Yasir that Imam Ali Amir al-Mu'mineen was on the side of the truth and on the side of the haqq. But this is their argument, so for the sake of that argument, let's play by their narrative. And so he stood there making it clear to who it was, and he was killed. And so what happens after that? They go to him. They tell him, Muawiyah, we just killed Ammar ibn Yasir. And we remember Rasulullah saying that he will be killed by the transgressors and by the enemies of Allah. So are we the transgressors? Does that mean we're the evil ones? Now Muawiyah immediately responds saying, no, the people who killed him were the ones who brought him here. Of course, a very weak argument that's not accepted by any school of thought. But what do the schools of thought say in defense of Muawiyah? They say that it was unclear to us who killed Ammar ibn Yasir. They say it was unclear which side he was on. We don't know. Was it the side of Amir al-Mu'mineen who killed him, or was it the side of Muawiyah? So it's the same people who used that argument with Muawiyah, they use it today. It's unclear. They try to dismiss the fact that it's very clear who the true enemies are and who the oppressors are by saying we're unsure and we do not know. And it's our job, therefore, to disseminate our knowledge about the occurrences. Disseminate the knowledge that we have in fighting against the oppressors. And this is the way of the Ahlul Bayt. This is the way of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So if we don't use our voices to protect Islam, we're not following the footsteps of the Imam alayhi salam. This was his mission, to protect the sanctity of the religion and to protect the sanctity of those who are oppressed. Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam was in his final moments, and he told his son, Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he told him, I will leave you with the same will my father, Imam al-Hussein, left me with. What is this will? He says, إِيَّاكَ وَظُلْمَ مَنْ لَا يَجِدُ عَلَيْكَ نَاصِرًا إِلَّا اللَّهِ. He says, be careful, O my son, do not oppress an individual who has no one to support him against you but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is so important that two Imams had to say it as their last will. This shows us to have hope, that this is huge in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When someone has nobody but him and is being oppressed, Allah will serve his justice. They will get what's coming their way. They will pay the consequence for what they're doing. And so on nights like these, Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam was at the end of his struggle, and he farewells his son Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam. He says his last wills to him, and then he gives him a hug, and slowly the poison begins to enter into his system, and the poison begins to take over his body. Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, in his final moments, he bids farewell to his family once more, and then he closes his eyes, he lays down on the ground, and Imam al-Sajjad begins to shiver and begins to sweat. At this moment, Ajarakumullah, the Imam's soul departs this world. Aina al-munadi wa imama wa sayyida wa madluma. This was the end of the tragedy of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam. But where was the tragedy? When did the tragedy occur? Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, he says, I then went to go wash the body of my father, Imam al-Sajjad. And I went and I took off his clothes, and I saw the shackles of the chain marks on his neck. I saw the bruising on his arms and his legs. This was the struggle that Imam al-Sajjad had to face as they paraded him as a prisoner from one city to another, from Karbala to Kufa to Sham, with the women and the children of the family of Rasulullah. And Imam al-Sajjad, after that, he lived the tragedy every single day. The narrations say every time he wanted to drink some water, he would have the cup in front of him and he would begin to cry and weep until the cup of water was filled with his tears. One day he saw a man preparing to slaughter a sheep. He goes towards this man and he tells him, "O butcher, did you quench the sheep a drop of water before you are going to kill him?" Imam al-Sajjad, the man looks at Imam al-Sajjad. He says, yes, ya ibn Rasulullah, of course I did. This is the way of Rasulullah. We do not kill any animal until we quench it, even with a drop of water. The Imam looks towards Karbala and he begins to cry. He says, my father Hussein was killed thirsty. They did not quench him even a drop of water. Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam every day would live this tragedy. Years after the tragedy of Karbala, he was unable to get over this. The poet says on nights like these, his soul departed this world. But it was in Karbala where his life was taken from him. The narrations say one man comes to Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam. He asks him, Ya ibn Rasulullah, when will your grief end? He asks him, when will you stop crying? When will you stop grieving over this tragedy? Imam al-Sajjad looks at the man. He tells him, oh man, why do you blame me? Why do you blame me for my grief? And you know that Yaqub alayhi salam lost one son in Yusuf, and he had hope that one day Yusuf would return to him, and he cried for decades after Yusuf until his eyes became blind. Why do you blame me? وأنا رأيت أبي وأهل بيتي يذبحون حولي. How do you blame me? And I saw my father and I saw my family members all being slaughtered in front of me. يقل بعيني رأيت حسين بيد الطفل منحور ومرة ما بتعاينه ودموعها تفور وأعظم مصيبة زيدت حزني علي شنو مولاي داست على جسم العزيز خيول مية داست على جسم العزيز خيول مية سلبوا عزنا وسيروا زينب سبية والنوياي إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون وسيعلم الذين ظلموا آل محمد أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون نسألك اللهم وندعوك باسمك العلي الأعظم الأعز الأجل الأكرم يا الله 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 اللهم نسألك بحق مريض كربلاء اشفي كل مريض واقض حوائج المؤمنين والمؤمنات اللهم وفقنا لزيارة الحسين ووفقنا لخدمة الحسين ووفقنا لخدمة زوار الحسين في عامنا هذا وفي كل عام وإلى أرواح المؤمنين والمؤمنات ومن مات على الهدى والإيمان ولتعجيل فرج مولانا صاحب العصر والزمان نقرأ سورة الفاتحة تسبقها الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد
Yasir for that fantastic lecture. Inshallah, we're going to begin with salat as we have approached salat time, and then inshallah we'll resume with our final portion with eulogy latmiya after salat, as we have entered into the salat time right now. So inshallah, for the sisters, the washrooms are upstairs, so you could head up there. Inshallah, we'll begin salat immediately with adhan. Thank you, brothers and sisters, and we'll resume inshallah after salat.